All right, 11:05. Let's get started. Welcome, everybody. It's Friday. We made it. This is our live demo event. This week at Sematic was Feature Week, where we announced a whole set of new features that we shipped in the last few weeks. And this event is meant for all of you to discover those features and also discover Sematic at large, meet the team behind the product. So first, how is this going to play out? I'm going to go through some slides to give you a high-level overview of what Sematic is, how it works, what value it can bring to you. And then I will go into a live demo, and hopefully everything will work. And I'll showcase all those new features. After that, I'll let you know how to get your own Sematic t-shirt and stickers. And I'll also give you an overview of what's coming up in the next few months for us. And eventually we'll have a question session at the end. That being said, in the meantime, while I'm going through the demo, feel free to ask questions in the chat. We have all our team members here online. And so they'll be happy to answer any questions for you. So let's get started. So Sematic defines itself as an open source, continuous machine learning platform. It's essentially a pipelining tool that enables you to chain your business logic and end-to-end pipeline, or typically to retrain your models or refresh metrics and so on. The goal is to make it as automated as possible so that you can retrain models very easily whenever you get new data or iterate on future models that you're trying to ship. So I'll get into more specifics as to what it means. But first, I want to go over the team at Sematic. So we're a team of 5 engineers from 4 different countries. We have spent the last 10 years working at a whole set of tech companies, ranging from Google, Microsoft, Adobe, and so on. And in recent years, we worked at Cruise, the self-driving car company. This is where we met. We spent the last 4 years as tech leads of the ML infrastructure at Cruise, building all sorts of infrastructure products for ML engineers to build those complex pipelines to ship models to the Cruise cars. So we have a lot of experience in that area. And now with Sematic, we're trying to bring this experience to the rest of the industry, and we're trying to make it open source as well so that everybody can benefit from here. So I think here on the call, we have Josh, we also have Tudor, we have Sash. I think Chance is still on the Chinese time zone, so he wasn't able to join us, but everybody else is here. So feel free to ask questions. They'll be happy to answer them for you. So let's jump into what Sematic is in itself. So at its core, it's really a machine learning orchestration platform. It lets you chain sequences of tasks to be able to produce an output. Each of those steps could be, processing data, reading from a database, processing data, creating a featureized data set, feeding this data set into a training step to prepare your model, and then doing evaluation, testing, and so on. Typically, how it works with Sematic is that you start by developing pipelines on your local machine in Python. So we have a very lightweight Python SDK that lets you define not only the actual business logic of your pipeline step, but also the flow of data between the pipeline steps. So this is different from other tools out there that typically require to define a YAML file, even sometimes to template this YAML file to do more complex things. In Sematic, everything is Python. You don't need to learn any sort of other complex DSL or technology. Just write Python as you would a regular application, and that creates a pipeline. Now, once you have this pipeline, you can run it on your local machine, whether it's your local laptop or a VM that you may have in the cloud. And so that's typically good to iterate on the pipeline, debug your code, making sure that everything looks fine. What we've seen in the past that people will run on their laptop with a small amount of data, like maybe 1 or 10% of your data set. And once they have a satisfactory result at that stage, then they can run the same pipeline at scale in the cloud, whatever your cloud provider is, to have access to your data warehouse, your GPU cluster, and whatnot. So this is the typical iteration loop that people go through. They write code, iterate locally, and then submit the job to run at scale. Sematic will take care of packaging your local environment and shipping it to your cloud infrastructure. As you're iterating on your pipeline, whether locally or remotely, you can monitor and track the execution of your pipeline in the UI. I will show you the UI during the demo. The idea is that you can visualize not only the execution graph, so what's going on in your pipeline, the different steps, the status of those steps, failure, success, and so on, but also all the artifacts. So all the inputs and outputs of each of the steps are visualizable in the UI, whether they're configurations, data frames, models, or plots. You can see them directly in a UI and monitor them. We also surface debug information, so there are exceptions and logs, so that you can iterate quickly on your pipelines. So what kind of pipeline can you typically write with Sematic? There's a variety of things you can do. You can, for example, do your typical data science pipelines where you're maybe reading some data into pandas data frame, using NumPy for computations, and then producing metrics and plots with matplotlib. That works very well. You can also do more machine learning pipelines where you're trying to train maybe a regression or a boosted tree, and you want to produce outputs, a model, and some plots. That also works very well with Sematic. Maybe you want to do something a little bit more involved with some deep learning pipeline where you want to process images or videos with TensorFlow or PyTorch. This also works well with Sematic. And eventually, the goal is that you can automate those things in your cloud infrastructure. So you can also do those like long end-to-end complex cloud-based pipeline where you read data from a data warehouse or your cloud storage, and then leverage your GPU cluster, run some Spark job and whatnot. So you can do any of those things, and obviously any combination of those things is also works. If you're not doing machine learning, if you're just chaining some data processing jobs, that also works. Any of those things are suitable for Sematic. Now, what kind of guarantees comes with using Sematic? So the first thing that we're aiming for is a high level of usability. We know how difficult it is to implement pipelines, orchestrate them in the cloud. So we claim to have the easiest way to get started, the lowest barrier to entry. You just write Python code on your local machine, you iterate on the pipeline there. You don't need to deploy anything to get started. Everything is defined in Python, both the business logic and the actual DAG of the pipeline. You don't need to have any infrastructure skills to get started. You just pip install Sematic locally and you can start from there. Everything works out of the box on your laptop. You define your pipeline in Python and you execute in UI. You can visualize the DAG right away. Then the next benefit we're going after is traceability. This is very important to have a full traceability of your pipeline, not only for experiment tracking, knowing exactly what you've been running the past few days, for example, or your experiments, but also, let's say you deploy your model to production, something goes wrong, you need to be able to go back to what data set was used, what configurations were used, and so on. In Sematic, all the inputs and outputs of all your pipeline steps are tracked and visualizable in the UI. We also surface source code that's been used, the Git information, we track all that. We track the container images that have been produced to submit your cloud pipeline. We obviously persist also the execution graph of the pipeline. All your runs are being tracked, and all this tracking data is visualizable directly in the UI, and I will show you that in a minute. Then the next benefit we're going for is observability. That is the ability to get a handle on what's going on with your pipeline, especially in case of failures. So for that purpose, we surface logs in the UI so that you don't have to forage your cloud infrastructure to find what happened in your job. So you don't need to go after your Grafana, CloudWatch, or whatever it is you're using and scroll through pages and pages of logs to figure out what happened. We surface those things directly in the UI so that you can have information to iterate on your pipeline. We also surface failure information. Let's face it, your pipeline is going to fail often. So it's important to have access to those failures directly in the UI so that you can quickly find the issue and fix it and then iterate on the pipeline. So this is how we guarantee observability. In the future, we'll probably have features also to surface resource usage. For example, if you use GPUs or high memory instance and so on, you need to probably figure out how much of it you're using. If you have a low usage of your GPU and so on, we will also surface this in the future. All this makes for really easier debugging and a faster iteration loop. And then finally, reproducibility is also a very important aspect of your pipelines. As you know, in machine learning, explainability of models is a big topic, a big subject of discussion, and that starts with being able to reproduce your results. Once you have a model that is trained, if you cannot reproduce it, it's really hard to investigate issues. So we guarantee this by first tracking all of those container images that we use to execute your pipeline in the cloud. All this are tracked and persisted in our metadata database that ensures that you can rerun pipelines from the UI. That's one of the new features we're shipping, and I'll show you how this works, so that at any time in the future, you can re-trigger an execution of your pipeline from the UI. You can do that from scratch. Maybe you want to just rerun the pipeline with new data, or from an arbitrary point inside the pipeline. Maybe you don't want to rerun your upstream steps. And you can do that with the same code that you've used before to just reproduce the results. Or you can do this with updated code so that maybe you can fix a bug and rerun from there. And I'll show you how that works in the UI. So these are all the guarantees that come with using Sematic. And another nice feature that you get out of the box with Sematic is the ability to collaborate with the rest of your team. We have this chat box that I will show you in the UI that lets you leave notes on runs so that you can keep track of all the runs that you've executed and leave a note for each of them so that you can remember, this is the good run, or this is the bad run, this is the run with all the data, and so on. And you can collaborate in the UI with your team. As I mentioned, this week was feature week at Sematic, so we announced a number of new features that we shipped over the last few months. So I'm going to go over those during the demo, but we shipped things around traceability. So we added this Git integration that picks up all your local Git information and persists it alongside your pipeline metadata. We also shipped improvement to observability with logs and exceptions in the UI. We added improvements around fault tolerance. As I mentioned, your pipeline was going to fail due to many potential issues. It's important that your steps are able to retry themselves automatically. And finally, we added a layer of usability with those pipeline reruns. Now I'm going to go into the demo. Before going into a demo of the features, I want to show you how pipelines are defined in Sematic. So here on the left, I have some code. Can somebody tell me if it's big enough for people to read? All right, that seems fine. So the idea with Sematic is that you basically take your regular Python function. In this case, this is a Python function that receives a data loader, a PyTorch data loader, a configuration, trains a model, and returns the trained model. This is a regular Python function that you would have written maybe in your notebook or in your code base. And what you need to do to convert this function to a pipeline step is simply to add this sematic.func decorator. The only thing that you need to do is to decorate this function with this decorator. You can ignore at this time all those arguments here. The only thing you need to do at first is just to decorate this function. What it means to convert this to a pipeline step, it means that it will be tracked in the UI, in our database, and in the UI, you will be able to visualize those inputs and also the output that is returned. And you can see this example here on the right-hand side in the UI. You have this train model box here that corresponds exactly to this function. And so if I click on this box here, I will be able to take a look at here the inputs. So this is the config object that was passed to this function. Here I have my training data loader that was also passed to this function and my PyTorch device. And the output, which was a PyTorch model, is here my model, and so on. And I can also take a look at the source code here, which is the same as you have here in the code. So this is how you define a single step. Now, how do you chain those steps to create a pipeline? I'm going to scroll down to the pipeline function here and go back to the execution graph. As I explained earlier, the way to define a pipeline in Sematic is simply to call your steps in Python, get the output, and pass it to the downstream steps. So for example, here, I have a step that is loading my MNIST dataset into this variable here, and then I'm passing this variable as an input to a data loader down here. And this is exactly what you're seeing here in the graph. We are passing the output here, the data set, to the get data loader step, and so on. So the flow of the pipeline, the DAG, is also defined in Python, not in some YAML file, which means that you can do some pretty exotic things with pipelines. You can, for example, loop on a number of configurations. For example, here we're calling the train eval subpipeline once, but we could be looping over a number of training configurations with different hyperparameters and trigger it multiple times. So we could have this train eval subpipeline being running maybe 5 or 10 times in parallel with different sets of hyperparameters. This is very natural to do. Just loop over the Python object. That's the same way you would do in a regular Python code. You can also do like conditional branching and so on for more dynamic pipelines. This is very convenient. So yeah, this is as easy as it is to define a pipeline in Sematic, and then you get this nice graph here, and you can browse through all the steps. So we looked at the train model step. Now let's take a look at the evaluate model step here. It is the function that is defined right up here. So it's taking as inputs the model that was passed in from the train model step. Here is my PyTorch model. Here's my test data loader and the PyTorch device, exactly those inputs that we see here in the code. And the output is this data class here that has 3 metrics and then 2 plotly figures. And if we switch to the output tab here, we can see exactly those fields are being rendered in the UI. As you can see, you don't need to register anything by hand yourself in the code. It's all done out of the box by Sematic. You can see the metrics that we see in the data class, and then a couple of plots, the plotly figures that we also return as part of the pipeline. So this is really as easy as it is. Just decorate your functions, create the flow of the pipeline, and then execute and so on. So this is the high level how pipeline works. For each of those steps, you can of course take a look at the source code here. You can also take a look at logs for this step. So let me switch to an older execution to get, there it is. In this case here, this is the simple log of my training model function. As you can see, my code was outputting just some regular log function, outputting just printing out the loss of the model at this particular iteration. And here, this is one of the features that we added recently, the ability to view logs. Typically, if I didn't have this here, I would have to go through my container logs. So having access to Kubernetes, trying to figure out where this particular function ran, streaming the logs, finding all that, which was very difficult. So now we surface this directly in the UI so that you can have access to this information right here. So this is super handy. Now, another feature that we shipped this week is our Git integration. As you can see here in the top right, you have this Git information that's been picked up at runtime. When you submit your pipeline, we extract the Git information from your local repo and we persist it so that you always know exactly what's running. And you can also click on those links to see exactly what code was running. So in this case, if I click here, this is going to open this particular Git commit diff that was used for this pipeline. Also, sometimes not all code has been committed to Git. So we have this little indicator here that tells you that you also had some uncommitted changes that will not be represented in the UI. So this is also a feature that we shipped this week. Another big feature that we shipped is the ability to rerun pipelines, as I mentioned. It's pretty frequent that pipelines will fail or that you will want to refresh a model. So what you could do is either try to find in your code base where the code is, how to run it. You could ask the owner of the model, of the pipeline, oh, how do I run this pipeline? Or you could just simply go into the UI and click here, click rerun, and that will rerun your pipeline from scratch. Now, typically, you may not want to run from scratch because some of your upstream steps may have already succeeded and they may be expensive, like data processing or GPU compute, and you only want to rerun from a particular place in your pipeline. So let's say for this particular pipeline, you want to rerun only the evaluation step at the bottom here, not all the upstream steps. So you're going to click on evaluate model here, and that opens the panel that we saw before for this particular pipeline step. And you can click down on the action menu here, and you can click here, rerun pipeline from this run. That will create a clone of the pipeline where the upstream steps are not going to be rerun. So I'm going to click this here. It's going to create a new run, and I'm going to do this right now. And there it is. I get notification here from the new run. So I'm going to click here. It's going to open the new run. So here it is. Right now, it's empty because it's launching. It's going to take a bit of time because we're launching a container job on Kubernetes. So it's going to take a few seconds to get started. But as soon as it starts, you will see that all the upstream steps have been cached. In the meantime, while this is loading, I want to show you our new retry functionality. As I explained, it's pretty frequent that your pipelines will fail due to temporary failures, typically network interruptions, timeouts, connection errors. If you're streaming data from a bucket, for example, or from a data warehouse, oh, there it is. See, now the graph has been duplicated. All the upstream steps have already been cached. They're already green. And now only this step is rerunning. So I'm here rerunning with the exact same code. And I will show you in a minute how I can rerun this with different code. Going back to the retry feature, as I mentioned, it's pretty frequent that your pipeline will fail if you have like a long end-to-end pipeline because of temporary failures. If you're hitting for example, third-party services, and there are no rate limiting or any type of timeouts, then your step will fail, and you don't want your entire pipeline to fail for that reason. So you can pass this retry option here to your decorator, and you can tell the settings what kind of exceptions should be retried. So in this case, for example, I want to retry if I get a connection error or a timeout error, and I want to retry 5 times. That means that if any of those things happen while your step is running, the step will automatically retry on your behalf. All right, so as you can see, the new pipeline has succeeded here, only the evaluate step as rerun. And that's easy as that. Just go in the UI and click rerun from here. The failure that you want to retry could be due to a bug in your code. Now, it happens. We all write bugs in code. And so sometimes you're like, oh, it's a shame. My entire pipeline has succeeded except for like this last step where I had a bug. So typically in that case, you do not want to rerun the entire pipeline. You want to just rerun this one last step with some updated code. The way to do this, obviously you can do this from the UI because you need to do this where the code lives. The way to do this is to click on the step that you want to rerun here. You can copy here the run ID that you want to retry. And then in your console, I'm going to bring up here my console. You just bring up the command line that you would use to execute your pipeline. So in this case, it was this one, pass -- rerun from, and then you paste the run ID from which you want to retry, and then you submit. It's going to take a bit of time here because we have to register the image. And then it will basically rerun this pipeline with the updated code from your local machine so that you don't have to rerun all the upstream steps. So it's going to take a bit of time. In the meantime, I'm going to check on questions in the chat. Hi, Richard. It's nice to see you here. Yeah, thanks, Tudor and Josh, for filling questions. So yeah, my pipeline is currently submitting with the updated code, and pretty quickly you will see, there it is. We have the notification here in the UI. So I'm going to click here. This is my new pipeline with the updated code. And in a few seconds, this will show the new pipeline. Will it be free, or will it be like Weights and Biases where you have to sign up? Yeah, that's a good question. So at this time, the product is open source, so you're free to use it. You can, do pip install Sematic start. You're free to use it locally. You're also free to deploy it yourself in your infrastructure if you know how to do this. Right now, we don't have a hosted solution. In a few months, we will release, and there it is. The pipeline now is executing with only the step that we are trying to rerun. That's it for the live demo. So let me switch back to the slides, and then we can talk about roadmap items. I see also a question from Z. I'm going to keep all those questions for the Q&A session at the end. Right now, I will jump back into the slides and go into roadmap and Q&A at the end. So if you want your own version of this t-shirt with our nice like Sami little mascot on it and the name of the company at the back, feel free to first go to GitHub and star us. I think we're almost at 600. Let me check. We were at 597 before. So if you go there right now and star our repo, we'll pass the 600 bar. And once you do this, send us your mailing address. So email me at emmanuel@sematic.dev. Send me your shipping address and your t-shirt size, and I will send you this t-shirt and some stickers. So talking about roadmap, I see tons of questions about this. First, we want to ship more integration with the rest of your toolkits. Right now, we are working on a Spark integration so that you can run your data processing pipelines as part of a Sematic pipeline. This will probably be available at the end of Q1, and will probably be also totally integrated with the rest of our stack so that you don't need to contract any external services as well. Also, we're working on a Slack integration so that you can get notifications in your Slack channels when your pipeline succeeds or fail, with some debugging information like exceptions and so on, but also so that the chat box that you see in the UI can also post messages in Slack so that you can have a two-way conversation there. We are also thinking about integration with typical labeling services such as Scale AI so that you can automatically trigger your pipeline when you have new label data coming in. And also we're thinking about integration with all the popular data warehouses. We already support Snowflake, and we're thinking about BigQuery, Redshift, and so on. Also soon, by the end of Q1, we'll support a way to cache upstream runs so that you don't have to rerun steps that haven't changed when you're iterating on pipelines. Then the UI will also see a ton of improvements. We'll add the ability to search through runs, either the name, tags, descriptions, and so on, search artifacts to quickly access the results you're looking for. The ability to rerun with different inputs is also very, very practical. And then also in the future, we'll think about model serving. Once your model is trained, it's great, but what do you do with it? You probably want to serve it behind a REST endpoint so that you can query it from your production app. So we'll probably think about supporting this in the next few quarters. And eventually, as mentioned, we want to also provide a fully hosted platform so that you don't have to deploy anything in your own infrastructure. You can just use our own. In that case, we'll have different tiers of services. There was a question about whether you have to pay for it. We'll probably have a free tier so that you can use the product. Obviously, if you want to use things like GPUs or more heavy lifting pipelines, you definitely will have to pay a service fee, but we'll definitely have a free tier for that. So that's it for our roadmap. And now let's move on to questions. So I'm going to go through the chat here, see if I addressed everything. So yeah, so there was a question about where you have to sign up. So yeah, as I mentioned, you're free to use the open source version. In the future, we'll have a SaaS product that you can use probably with a free tier, but also a paid tier as well. Do you support data versioning? In Sematic, we do not persist the actual data that you consume in your pipeline. For example, if you're reading data from your BigQuery table, Snowflake, or whatever it is, we do not store that data. The data belongs to you. You're the one that is consuming it and then writing it back to another table. What we persist is a reference to that data set. So maybe it's a data class that describes the data set, the table, the data set, the project name, and so on, maybe some query parameters. This is what we persist. So in that metadata, if you are yourself have a way to version your data, so maybe it's a time range of rows that you've been querying or an index range, then this will be persisted as part of your Sematic artifacts. Other than that, if you are always returning, for example, a different model every time, we always persist the different model object. Same if you're returning a data frame. If your data frame changes, obviously we will always persist a different one, which means that it is versioned and persist in our database. Will the recording be on YouTube? Yes, we are recording this and we will be posting it probably over the weekend or early next week. Any thoughts on zipping or multi-view of separate runs in the UI? Yes, that's a good question. Absolutely. We're thinking about in the future, obviously, we have tons of things on the roadmap, but a way to compare runs is obviously very practical, where you can probably select in a list of runs 2 or 3 runs that have the same output types, and then you can have a sort of diff view of the outputs. Can we currently schedule the pipeline? So at this time, we do not support scheduling. So an easy way to do it would be to use just a cron schedule in your own VMs on your own machine. In the future, we'll have definitely different triggering mechanisms. So either it is a cron schedule, so like you want to train every day, for example, or every week. We'll also probably support a way to trigger your pipelines from the API. So you want to post an HTTP request to trigger your pipeline, and also potentially event-based triggering. If you want to trigger your pipeline when you have new sets of label data coming in, we'll also try to support this in the future. Are you running the demo in a local laptop or in a cloud? It was all running in the cloud. I was not running on my local laptop. So the rerun feature is actually only available in the cloud because obviously we need to have access to the container images. When you run pipelines locally, we do not build any container images, so we can't rerun the pipeline at this time. So yes, I was rerunning in the cloud. How to specify dependency of tasks in the pipeline? So the way you do this is simply as I showed in the code. So let me actually switch back to the code and go to my pipeline definition here. For example, here, I'm taking the output of this step here, the train data set step, and passing it as an input to this get data loader. And you bring back the DAG here. And this is how you create this dependency here. As you can see here, the output is passed as the input of get data loader as a data set. And this is how you define a dependency between step by passing the data. Now, I realize in some cases, you have a dependency, this step needs to happen before this step, but you don't have an actual data object that is being passed from one step to the next. The way to do this at this time is to create a fake data object. So it could be like a Boolean or a simple string or an integer that you pass from the upstream step to the downstream step, and that will trigger a dependency that will generate the dependency that we will display in the UI and treat as such. What is the next big feature for Sematic? I think the next big significant feature that we will ship is our Spark integration. As you know, in your end-to-end pipelines, you often have to chain things like data processing to read your raw data from your data warehouse, prepare it into a feature data set before you pass it on to your training job. So to do this, you have multiple options. A very popular one is Apache Spark that lets you parallelize, do MapReduce type of processing. We are currently working on an integration, and that will run as part of your pipeline, and that will probably be available by the end of Q1. Could you tell us more about model serving and how that might work with people using those new REST endpoints? Yeah, so here I don't want to commit too much because this hasn't been scoped or designed or anything like that. But potentially the way that it could work is once you're in the UI here, for example, here, this train model step, this is a model object. You could potentially have a button here that would you could click deploy, and that would use the Docker image in which we have trained this model to serve this endpoint. So it means that we would, trigger a Kubernetes deployment and have this being served by a REST endpoint. You would be able to query that from your production app. So posting maybe a JSON payload of your features and getting in return the predictions. Obviously, there are many technical complexities around this, so it's not a trivial feature at all. So we will think very hard about this feature. Also, probably the ability to add some pre-processing to your feature before you generate inference. So I don't think this will come in the next couple of months, but maybe in the next few quarters. Could you share more about scale integration? I'm from Nucleus. Yeah, so same thing. We haven't scoped this yet, but we saw in our past jobs, for example, at Cruise, how important it is to be able to trigger your pipeline when you have new sets of labeled data coming in. So typically, you're doing data mining in your production data. You're sending those items to be labeled by Scale AI or Labelbox or any of those, and you get notifications back, either push notifications or any other types of way to let you know that maybe you have a batch of like 10,000 new images have been labeled. So it's important that you are able to automatically retrain your model. So at this time, you could do this, by hand in your infrastructure by, having your own sort of job that receives those notifications and then trigger your Sematic pipeline. In the future, we will provide ways to automate this so that you can subscribe to those events and then pass along the payload that you receive from those notifications to your pipeline to be able to update your model. Yeah, 600 stars. Thank you so much, everybody. That's great. Amazing. Send us your shipping address and we'll get your t-shirt on the way. Is there integration with a feature store? At this time, we haven't looked into this, but we are happy to discuss this. If you have any particular feature store that you're interested in, feel free to join our Discord channel, post information about the feature store you want to see integrated, and we're happy to talk about it. We're almost at time. If there are no more questions, I want to thank everybody for joining. It was really great to have you all here. This was a success. I think we can do this again next quarter when we have a new set of features to announce. And maybe next time we can have some of you as guests to show us how you're using Sematic. In the meantime, I also want to thank everybody on the team here, Josh, Tudor, Sash, that have been fielding questions. Join us in Discord, take part of the conversation, tell us what you like about Sematic, report bugs as well, and feature requests, and so on. Thank you so much. I'm going to sign off at this time. Have a good Friday and see you on Discord. And don't forget to send us your shipping address for your t-shirts. Bye-bye, everybody.